You're listening to episode 166 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author and teacher David Webster joins us to speak about his book, Dispirited, How Contemporary Spirituality Makes Us Stupid, Selfish, and Unhappy. What happens when we have the ability to pick and choose components from various religious traditions and try to integrate them into our practice? This cafeteria spirituality, as it's sometimes called, can be very appealing. Rather than having to accept, whole cloth, every supernatural assertion, ritual, and nuance of a particular lineage, in today's society we may have the ability to be more selective. Secular Buddhism is certainly growing as a distinct type of Buddhist practice because of that freedom to choose. But there are certain risks associated with cafeteria spirituality as we make choices based on what's easy rather than what's helpful. David Webster holds a PhD in Buddhist studies and currently teaches religion, philosophy, and ethics at the University of Gloucester. He has worked for various universities and has studied philosophy, Hinduism, and Buddhist thought at Sunderland Polytechnic and at Newcastle University. In addition to scholarly works on Buddhism and desire, the nature of belief, and other topics in Buddhist studies at the Philosophy of Religion, David has also written about blues and death in religions. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice pear martini in honor of German brain scientists working in California. It's a long story, just go with it. And our guest today is David Webster. Dave, thanks for being here.
Pleasure, thanks.
So we're going to get talking about your book, Dispirited, How Contemporary Spirituality Makes Us Stupid, Selfish, and Unhappy. And this is based on a Tricycle article that just came out that I ran across. And for folks listening, I'll be linking to that article on the episode page for this episode. But Dave, let's get started by asking you to tell us about your background. What brought you to this practice?
Well, I think, like many people, or quite a few people, my study of and encounter with Indian religions, and particularly with Buddhism, was an accident. It wasn't intended, it wasn't sought out, it wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't, in my case, a reaction to having a kind of trauma that sought me to try and find something to sort it out. I grew up in Leicester, which is in England, in the East Midlands. It's not very glamorous. If anyone knows it, people think it's a lot less glamorous than even that. But one thing that it did have, I didn't really notice at the time, in the way that you don't notice things when you're a kid because everything's normal, was that it had a very big Hindu population due to the movement of peoples from East Africa, from former colonial countries during the 1970s. So there's a big Hindu population there, and there still is. But I kind of noticed them, was vaguely aware of them. I remember asking questions about why are there swastikas above doors? They're kind of rather weird. And he explained, no, they're not. It's not loads of Nazis, it's loads of Hindus. You know, it's different. And I'm thinking, all right, that's fine, but not really thinking much of it. And then I was originally planning to go to Polytechnic University to study something else, and that kind of didn't work out, as these often don't when you hit your teenage years. So I ended up very much by kind of random accident, going to do philosophy and the study of religions at the what later became the University of Sunderland. And I discovered when I got there that one of the tutors, who's now more widely known, I guess, is Professor Peter Harvey, who's written on Buddhism widely.
He's been on the
Uh,
podcast, yeah.
yeah, very good. Just get him on audio. Um, and he was one of the people who taught me at Sunderland. So that kind of slowly, very much a slow burn, sparked interest in Buddhism along with European philosophy. Then I went about 10 miles north to do my master's in British Hinduism. So I went back to my home city and kind of looked into the Hindu community, what was going on with them. Um, but I didn't want to carry that on to a kind of further level. I kind of got more and more fascinated by looking at Buddhist texts and found that for research purposes, for my interest at the time, I didn't want to talk to people much, really. People are difficult and awkward and don't always say what you want. Um, so I started reading more and more of the kind of Pali canon, early Buddhist texts, and they really were. I found them kind of fascinating. So I decided to do my PhD on that, which I think was a good decision. It was good for me, which then grew into a doctoral bit of research, and also the book, The Philosophy of Desire in the Buddhist Pali Canon, and a much more close textual study. And then again, somehow by accident, into working with universities and working with students, which I very much like, but it's very much it wasn't planned. I'm
Sort
always a
of
bit,
ended up in your life as is.
yeah, I'm always a bit suspicious of people who have 5-year plans.
Me too. Never have that happen in an interview. What's your 5-year, 10-year, and 15-year plan? Like, I can't really know what's coming next week, so my plans are a little more manageable than 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah, quite. You sometimes meet people like that, but I was trying to shy away, I think.
So you've been teaching for a while, and the book Philosophy of Desire and the Buddhist Pali Canon. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Tell us now about Dispirited. What led you to write that, and what's it about? Give us an outline.
Sure. Well, I've been working in Buddhist studies, working in universities, writing appropriately scholarly and objective articles on aspects of Buddhist studies that no one read, or published in journals that no one could afford, and that was kind of interesting. But I felt kind of hankered. Well, I seem to have a bunch of opinions and maybe even more ideas and things, um, but I'm reaching a really narrow audience of real specialists, and I think I might have some to say about things that are going more broadly, more broad social, spiritual concerns. So I really thought it was about time to write a book or a short book that said what I thought, where I kind of stated a position much more openly than I might do in a scholarly article. So I thought, well, what do I think? What's really kind of either getting on my nerves or really kind of animating me in my thoughts and my conversations with friends? Um, and this printer was the product of that process. The summary, it starts off with people say, as they often say when you work in this kind of area, well, I'm not religious as a kind of social flagging, but I am very spiritual as a different kind of flagging. And I thought, I wonder what that means.
Hmm.
Because it confused me, as I was saying in the book. So it kept me to look at contemporary spirituality more broadly, uh, and how it seemed to have a variety of consequences, intellectual consequences, to do with the nature of truth that it seemed to somehow rather undermine. It seemed rather solipsistic, rather self-obsessed. A lot of kind of mind, body, spirit material seemed. Well, there's sections in the bookshop that say mind, body, and spirit that are very big. Um, they seem all to be books about me or books about oneself,
Hmm.
and not about kind of bigger social issues. They seem very inward looking. And also, I thought that the real existential questions about mortality and finitude and all those big questions, an awful lot of material within what was called contemporary spirituality seemed to either dodge the question or provide a kind of get out clause. I thought, well, that doesn't help us become more reconciled to these existential inevitabilities. So that's a rather long way around of saying there was a variety of things that I thought really weren't serving people very well and doing rather negative things. I thought, well, maybe I have to write something that actually engages with them rather than staying in a kind of ivory tower.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's difficult always to challenge the position of privilege of a religious assumption.
Mm. I think you're right, and I think I hadn't anticipated, and I think it's my fault, that the book would cause so much either outrage or consternation. I mean, obviously, it was provocative in terms of the title and the bits of the book that are provocative. I thought people would kind of take those in the spirit of debate, and even as some people who've disagreed violently have been very gracious and wanted to say, well, it raises questions I think deserve answers. Other people have been, I think, have kind of partly read it or misread parts of it, and have been fuming. And I thought, well, God, that's pretty kind of unprepared for that level of kind of rage that some people have had.
Yeah, yeah. And I imagine that's a bit difficult to deal with because the intent behind it is to start a dialogue on how our spirituality might be more than just looking inward, but might have a more social, real world impact, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think very much the book was intended to make people disagree with me, which they did, but also to argue about, well, what would that look like? I think what I come to try and edge towards at the end of the book, and at the end of my thoughts, and I talk about this a bit on my blog, is that's part of the work. But if we're going to not have that contemporary spirituality as our way of thinking about things, then where does that leave us? How do you build a kind of, in my case, a kind of atheism for the future that does respect notions of truth, that does engage with social justice, with bigger questions about equality, but also deals with existential realities that otherwise leave us discontented or very poor at dealing with the things that we have to face as humans.
Yeah, the big questions. The big questions.
Correct. So I think a lot of contemporary spirituality is rather, it looks like it deals with the big questions, but then it seems to rather dodge them by saying this, by being rather dualist. That's it. Some other realm which will survive as angels or spirits or beyond, and therefore it's all okay. And the view that I've taken, I think that some forms of Buddhism, certainly many forms of secular Buddhism, as I understand them, take is that it's really not going to be okay. We aren't going to be saved by somebody else, or even by kind of some realm which we can then go to and then work things out. We kind of need to do it now, if at all, and then perhaps only partially.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that comes up in discussions of even just Buddhism, even the traditional forms, that this is really based on you taking action for your own spiritual growth, we'll say, that there's not a reliance on an external supernatural entity to which you must in some fashion connect, whether usually through a person here in the world, some sort of religious figure. No, it's based on your own efforts. And in secular Buddhism, where really our focus is what we can know for sure, which is this world, because there are lots of different traditions that have lots of different ideas about what happens after you die, and they conflict. So as soon as one coughs up something that can clearly and unambiguously show to everybody, oh yeah, that's what happens when we die, I think it's a fair statement to go with, well, we do know what is beneficial and helpful in this world, so I can't imagine that's going to be a harmful thing. Let's go ahead and go with that.
Yeah, I think you say two things that are really interesting. I think are kind of worthy of comment. The first is that within Buddhism as a traditional religion, there's a spectrum, I think, between something that's very individually powered attempts to deal with this, and then it moves in some of its later iterations in some countries towards transferring more of that responsibility towards an external figure. And you get some models, perhaps in some forms of Pure Land Buddhism, for example, of course,
Yep, yep.
an
Very
example
true.
we've always used, that are much more, they look a bit more like salvation by grace. Yeah, and you get that, I think, and also a bit more, to lesser and greater extents in different traditions, where you throw yourself on the mercy of somebody else. And I can certainly see the appeal of that. But I think Buddhism is quite bracing in some of its early texts about the fact that no one's going to do it for you. There's that last line, depending on how you translate that, kind of last words of the Buddha in the Mahaparinibbana Sutra. He says, "Work your own salvation with diligence. Kind of get on with it." I thought, wow, that's really kind of telling us that that's a big job for us. And I think that's true. The second point you made was about, well, there are these different claims about life after death and things. I think the idea that there is not life after death, there may be something that happens that disproves it, but for the moment, that our death really, at least as far as we can tell, is our total and utter annihilation, is functionally safe. Because the world acts as a world would end that didn't have life after death. Now, maybe it's something we don't know about, but given the fact that we've been alive, or people have been living for a very long time, and the absence, really seriously, the absence of any evidence that's conclusive or clear or consistent about what might happen to us after death, it's just not there. It seems, we could be wrong. We wouldn't be so arrogant to say we're absolutely sure, but the world seems to act as if there isn't any life after death, and it seems if there is life after death, to make no difference to us now that there is.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a question that I always pose to folks who are pushing for a particular post-mortem idea that impacts the real world in some fashion. And I tend to ask, okay, I hear you. I understand that's where you're coming from. Describe to me what would be different in the world if it didn't operate that way, and when you die, you're gone. And it's a bit of a head scratcher because it would look like it does today.
Yeah, quite. You occasionally have people who will try and invoke the kind of ethical aspect that will say, if I didn't have the threat of heaven and hell, perhaps I would not refrain from lying or killing. Well, you think, not really? Does that say that you only act ethically because you're threatened? And actually, most people, even people who are very religious, when they reflect and think about that, they act like that because they're kind of good people. Not really because there's some kind of metaphysical threat hanging over their head. If they lose all that belief, they don't stop being nice people.
Right. It isn't what you believe that makes you a good person. It's what you do that makes you a good person.
No, quite absolutely. I had this discussion recently with someone. We were talking about, I think, questioning someone who'd written or was saying something about respecting beliefs. I'm thinking, I'm not sure I do respect the beliefs of others. I think I respect other people.
Yeah, yeah.
Respecting people seems quite important. Their rights and their position as kind of autonomous, ethical beings seems really important. But to respect beliefs, I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, it's going to depend on what does that belief entail. Is it something that's in complete conflict with the world as we know it, in which case we can question then how does one come to have that belief. But if it's really non-contributory, then it's not something really for me to disrespect or respect. It simply has no dependency on my own practice.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting way to view it. But there are beliefs that seem so potentially so kind of toxic. Kind of racist beliefs and kind of misogynistic beliefs that are so toxic that you think, I really, really don't respect them. And I think I might even disrespect them. Not in the sense of being horrible to people necessarily, but thinking, I really would, whenever I hear them, I want to challenge them.
Yeah, I find this to be flawed. Tell me how this works for you.
Yeah. I admire the kind of calm you can keep when that's the kind of response you might have. But yeah.
Yeah. So, Dave, something that was mentioned that I really wanted to ask about in the Tricycle article, because this, I think, was a very, very salient point that I'd not considered yet, is in this contemporary society where we have what might be called a cafeteria spirituality, where one picks and chooses the parts that you like from various faith traditions and you discard the rest. That may sound like a good idea in some ways because it's what works best for me, and I can understand that. But there are also some risks to that that's just based on human behavior. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think when I first encountered this kind of cafeteria buffet spirituality, you build your kind of platter from what's on offer from different religions. I think I thought, wow, that's really kind of a good thing because that's not about conflict. It's about what you need. It's about not looking at differences, but what unites us. All sorts of positive things. I can see those. However, the in terms of human nature or human character as it currently exists, there's a great danger, I think, that people will choose those things that they already believe with. So they'll pick out bits that suit them. At the more, one end of the scale, you might say they pick out a religion or a spirituality that suits their lifestyle, or suits their ethical views or philosophical views. What happens often when you accept a religion with the bits that you do like and the bits you don't, is that you have to work out why the bits that you don't like are there. Why am I being challenged to behave differently? You might ultimately come to not believe them, but you have to go through a process of thinking, the forebearers of this tradition obviously thought these aspects were all really important, and I see where these are, but these I can't. So perhaps I really need to get to full grips with them and try and see where they're not. Where if you're operating on a kind of buffet model, kind of cafeteria model, you call it, you don't have to. You can just say, "I'll put that back." Actually, I'll have some super mysticism. I'm not sure I want the kind of the radical social equality from liberation theology and Christianity things. That's going to cause me to give away all my goods to the poor. I'm not doing that. So I think it allows us to avoid the aspects of being religious that challenges ethically, and that really say to you, you can't do that. You can't be a Buddhist, a Catholic, whatever, and carry on doing that. If you want these aspects, you have to really reflect on these bits. Ultimately, you might come to not want to be like that and to reject them, and many people within religions have come to. But you have to take them seriously because you consider why are they there? Why people thought them really valuable.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that's simple human nature, that if it's something we're averse to, and it's not a matter of having an alignment with the principles behind a religion. That's certainly part of it, and totally get behind that. It's that there may be hard work involved. There may be some giving up that you do that you don't want to. For example, if you're averse to doing the hard work, sometimes at least, of meditation, you may say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to do X from some other tradition.
Oh, certainly you see that within Buddhism. I think people perhaps try some kinds of meditation. I had some students recently were doing some meditation practice, and they found it really hard. And if students, for example, or a person encounters that and finds, say, doing kind of samatha meditation, really kind of tiresome and hard, and as you put it, work, well, they'll go and I'll try some Tibetan visualizations. They're much more fun. Now, they both have their place. They might both bring about benefits to people. But the idea that if one gets too hard, you can say, oh, that's not for me. I'll try something else till I find something that isn't hard, seems to miss the point that actually, at least as far as I can understand it, meditation is kind of meant to be hard and meant to be painfully hard, I think. And being hard is kind of part of what it's about, and it's meant to develop in you, likewise, as far as I can tell, a sense of sitting with discomfort, and that leading to the development of patience and then ultimately some kind of equanimity. But that kind of being comfortable with discomfort, as it were, kind of dealing with something that you really don't want to do and still doing it, seems part of what some Buddhist traditions, and certainly more secularized Buddhist traditions, are really keen to promote. And this approach to spirituality seems to say, oh, if you don't like it, if you're not getting on with it, do something else.
Yeah, and that's one of the big. Yeah, you're totally right, and that's one of the big risks is that people will see often secular Buddhism. They'll say this is a watering down of the tradition, and my response to that is, if we were presenting ourselves as doing a Tibetan practice or a Theravada practice or a Zen practice, well, yes, you're right. This would be a watering down because we're not doing that. We're doing something else. And we want those different traditions to continue as they are. They've helped inform us. They've helped teach us. They've helped us with our practice. They help us grow. And they're part of an overall diversity in our Buddhist community. That's a great thing. It's just that we're finding, much as other people in other times have done over the past 2,500 years, finding resonance with what we really can put into practice and come to grips with in our lives without giving up the hard stuff, because the whole thing there does make sense to us. It's just the cultural context is very different. So we may not, for example, see the benefits to holding with a belief in a literal rebirth, but we can certainly see how the stories of that are interesting and inspiring to us and can help us with how we view this ongoing cycle moment by moment in our lives. So it's tricky business, exactly. That we need to watch our minds closely, which has always been part of this, to see that we're not just taking the easy way out in what we do.
No, I think it's a very kind of challenging and different, difficult process. And I think obviously Buddhism has always adapted and been changed by those people who practice it in different cultures and settings and things of this sort. So I think that's not new. And I think when I first encountered secular Buddhism, I thought, well, and like many people, I thought it was probably watering down a bunch of American hippies who just want the easy stuff and,
That's us. Yep.
nothing's changed. No, I then looked at some of the discussions and thought the thing that struck me the most was how serious people were about meditation and how much they disagreed. I thought, oh, good. That was a good one. The fact that people weren't all supportive, just saying you're brilliant, you're doing amazing work. They're actually getting involved with each other and saying that's not at all the case. That practice does work, and they really got into the detail of it. I thought that's kind of evidence that people are doing really hard work, meditation, for example, and trying quite vociferously to work out what is the case. So they weren't saying that everything was true and that this guy's truth was the same as this girl's truth, and it was just all part of the same happy. No, they were saying there is kind of way of doing this. It kind of seems to make some progress, and others that aren't quite so useful or problematic. And they were really getting into that. I thought, oh, that was kind of reassuring.
Yeah, and that's come up a few times. I just had a discussion with Vince Horn of Buddhist Geeks and mentioned your book and what we were just talking about with the cafeteria Buddhism, that we do disagree. And that's part of the learning process. And I tend to describe secular Buddhism today as an early exploration of what contemporary Buddhism might be for those of us within our cultural setting. We don't know what that's going to turn out to look like. That's going to take some time, and it's a constant evolution. And the impacts of social networking on how we relate to one another is, again, that itself is transforming how we do the practice.
Absolutely. I think so. It's a misconception to think of Buddhism, as often students do, as all gentle and friendly and lovely and nice. That's not horrible. But to think that Buddhism has never disagreed, or Buddhism has been marked out since its earliest history by schism and by falling out.
Right, right.
And that's got advantages and disbenefits, I guess, as well. But that's always been a feature of this kind of taking things really seriously. So seriously that if you can't work it out, your problems, you go and start another order or you leave. So people, I think that's a sign not so much of pettiness. I'm sure that's occurred at times in Buddhist history, but more of a kind of earnestness that seems to speak quite well or quite flatteringly of the fact that these things kind of matter.
Yeah, they do, and that's part of what we run into is that we're not always nice in our discussions. What we try as best as possible is to foster that atmosphere that is welcoming and friendly, and that we can at times disagree quite stridently about various topics, but still do so in a mutually supportive fashion. It's just we're not going to agree on this point. We understand we have different conditions and causes that led each of us to have our different views on things, and we just don't see that as a bad thing. We see that as a normal part of the complexity of human life.
Our culture is kind of against us. We tend to. I remember an American philosophy professor when I was a student saying, in our culture, particularly in Britain, and I think the same in Muslim North America, you're allowed to kind of disagree twice with somebody else, and after that, it just seems like you're being rude. We're not very good at disagreeing without it getting personal. So if someone disagrees with me and I say, well, I think you're wrong, they still disagree. And I say, well, I think, and they keep disagreeing. I kind of take it personally, saying, you call me an idiot. It tends to turn personal, potentially nasty, or to feel very vulnerable about being told that one's wrong. very quickly, and we seem quite poor at not agreeing. I think that's something that I think within philosophy, and I think within some Buddhist communities certainly, can help us find ways of getting better at that. We're not used to falling out to not. We're so polite often. Certainly in England, but we often agree with people we completely disagree with. So it's kind of learning how to disagree in a supportive way that you were describing. I think in itself is a big challenge.
It is, and I did an entire episode with part of the intent behind it was a discussion with Thupten Lekche, who is a Westerner who's in the Tibetan tradition, and we have a pretty clear and present disagreement about things like rebirth and what that means and how we approach it and the literal meaning of it or not. And that's okay. We still had a wonderful discussion and understood why we are in the different places we are and could still be mutually supportive of, but what we do today in our practice still counts. And finding that commonality was just a pretty terrific, but it's hard to do. And I think that's part of the nature of our lack of skills in communication, whether Buddhist or philosophy or politics or whatever the realm is. We don't know how to disagree and not very quickly devolve into not just not being nice, but being jerks. That's a challenge for us.
It happens very easily, I think, and that's I can see in part the appeal of many forms of what I talk about in the book is mind, body, and spirit or New Age thinking, is that they claim to put all that behind us because everybody agrees, everybody's right all at once, because disagreement while still holding respect for the person is, and we touched on this I think briefly earlier, it's very uncomfortable. We feel kind of not quite right. If I've fallen out with or disagreed with severely my friend, I feel like I want to put it right somehow by agreeing with them or getting them to come around and agree with me. And so kind of holding that kind of discomfort and things on that position takes, I think, quite a bit of practice. I think the appeal of some forms of contemporary spirituality is that they promise to make all that go away because I can be right and they can be right. We're just expressing some unsayable truth in different ways, and that's fine, and it makes all the problems evaporate. I think that's kind of dangerous, and it leaves us not doing the really hard work of working out how to disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's when it comes to a matter of one's beliefs, I actually don't care if someone has a belief with which I disagree if it doesn't impact my practice or harm others in some way. I'm okay with that. And usually the kinds of disagreements we have are of that nature, and they're not in the tangible and material actions we take in the world. So I don't have as much problem with those kinds of disagreements. One part that we do tend to get gummed up in, and I'd be interested to hear, Dave, your thoughts on this, is the challenges we have by saying, I don't know, that's not okay for us in spirituality, in really any realm. And so we fill it in, and we use the logical fallacy often of the God of the gaps. If it's not okay to say, I don't know, we need to fill it in with, well, here's the explanation we have that we can't really determine, and then everything's okay, we have an understanding. What are your thoughts on that kind of approach of filling in the missing pieces with, I don't know?
I think it comes partly, and certainly in terms of my personal subjective experience, I think it comes to a large degree from anxiety. If I admit that I don't know various things, who's going to take me seriously? Admitting to ignorance on a whole range of things would undermine my authority. It might make me be seen less seriously. It might make me look like an idiot. And it might also provide fodder to those who would argue with me and against me to say, well, we know and you don't know, then we've probably got a better position. I think as I get somewhat older, I start to realize that actually people don't know, and everybody else is kind of winging it as much as you are about certain fundamentally important things. And that actually it's much better in many discussions to be really honest and say, I don't know, and I kind of suspect that you don't either. To rather be happy to sit with that kind of that ignorance sitting there, But again, we're culturally conditioned to an extent to think that we have to answer everything. We need an answer. Religions, as they're taught in the West, I think, often they put themselves forward as question answering mechanisms. So Christianity, for example, has spent decades, well, hundreds of years, working out how to answer whole bunches of questions, bunches of books of apologetics. How do I deal with all these questions? And many religious books have how is the world made, what's it for, all these questions. And I think one of the things about some forms of Buddhism, and certainly Buddhism is maybe seems to have formed in its early phases, and somewhat to kind of maintain, is it doesn't seem to play that game. And I think some people who've got the cultural background when we're used to religion saying who made the world and for what, and also answering all the big questions, fully fit colouring in the picture. Some of them come to a tradition that we see has many potential benefits and things that really pull us towards it. Also, I think I want to colour in all the picture. I want answers to all these questions because many Buddhist traditions are quite keen to say, won't give them, sorry, won't say, we're going to give you undetermined questions or set them aside or say, I've really only come here to teach this. And if it doesn't pertain to this matter, it's irrelevant. It's like asking, use a Buddhist example, when the arrow's shot in your eye, what direction did it come from? What's it made of?
Who shot it? What's his name? What class did he come from?
Ouch, there appears to be an arrow in my eye. We do perhaps do something about
that. Exactly.
But I think many of us are used to religion being a big question answering mechanism, as long with being other things as well. And so to have a religious tradition who doesn't want to do that for various reasons, it might not know, it might not care, it might not think it matters. The various reasons why Buddhism engaged with certain kinds of questions. It might say that certain questions don't make sense in themselves. But that, I think, makes us, again, a little, particularly those from a Western background, a little unsure of ourselves and think, well, I kind of want answers, because I know, particularly socially, culturally, if I'm a Buddhist amongst people who aren't, therefore they're going to see me as that Buddhist guy who lives down the street, I'll go and ask him. He'll know the answer to what Buddhist thinks. What does Buddhism think about this? Well, I don't know. Well, what kind of Buddhist are you? And in fact, one of the questions that Tricycle asked me, they said half their readership doesn't identify as Buddhist. Presumably they take census or forms or questionnaires and things. People are quite reluctant to say, I'm a Buddhist in the West because either they're not sure they kind of are and feel like they might be a bit of a fake, or they fear perhaps things that come afterwards. Somehow just don't feel comfortable saying, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, it is. It's a challenge. Or how we designate ourselves is a big deal. There are societal impacts to having these designations. A lot of people who are atheists are in the closet atheists in their particular, say they're a teacher in a school system. They really can't because there are some negative impacts that are not supposed to happen, but which nonetheless do.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I don't know fully, but I would think that's probably even more extreme in North America, perhaps in the US, than perhaps in some parts of Britain. But though I think in much of Europe, it's very similar to case. We've seen quite a rash of people who are, I think the right phrase, kind of out as atheists in the UK, although people still get very kind of unsure and say, well, Dave, you're an atheist, but you seem to be working on leading and developing religious studies courses. What's that about? How do you kind of get to organise religious studies within a university or partly, and yet be an atheist? That doesn't make sense to it. So there's kind of some suspicion or confusion, or why would you be interested in matters of religion when you're not religious in the normal sense? And my answer to that is usually saying the questions that religions have answered have been many, but one set of questions they've answered have been, or tried to answer, is these big existential questions we began with.
Right. They're human experience questions. That is what's interesting about it.
Absolutely. And for a long period of time, the way in which humans have come to try and wrangle with questions about what it means to be human and what it means to be mortal has been through the lens of religion. So within religious traditions, as they existed across the planet, it's a whole bunch of amazing, interesting, fantastic stuff. You don't have to accept the metaphysical beliefs that go with it, but it's worthy of investigation. So I think that's normally the answer I give when people say, "What are you doing working here?"
So let's take a step over to your other book, which was your PhD thesis and now is in book form, The Philosophy of Desire in the Buddhist Polycanon, which for folks listening, I will also have a link to that, as well as to Dispirited, on the episode page for this episode. Dave, tell us a bit about what your thesis was and how you approached it.
Yeah, I was trying to work out what many people have looked at was saying, well, how does Buddhism deal with desire? With desire in a whole range of forms, but is there in Buddhism a paradox of desire? How can we desire to give up to desire? I want to desire less, but I want to desire less. Doesn't that short circuit it? So initially, it was that thinking about is there some kind of paradox here? Is there some kind of problem whereby my aspiration to not want anymore, to kind of do down my desire, is more problematic than it seems? So that was what started me off. What I seemed to try to look at within the Pali text, within those early texts, and anyone who's doing a kind of PhD said you have to narrow yourself to a fair bit, and I think that was quite good discipline, is that they seem to argue for a kind of typology of desires. Just saying there isn't a word in Pali for desire. There's a whole bunch of different words that specify different things. And that ultimately what we found in the Buddhist text, the early Buddhist text, was quite subtle. It seems that it's not only what you want that determines its ethical or skillfulness, its quality in that sense, but how you want it. I thought, wow, this kind of qualitative judgment of the nature of the type of desire seems quite distinctive, quite interesting, and worthy of further investigation. So it seemed to be about, yes, obviously it's better to want world peace than it's to want, a sandwich. Or to want for my enemies to be destroyed. We can, look at an ethical range of desires that are determined in terms of their object. Wanting something is better than, it's more ethical than wanting other things. But also we can say, actually, there are ways of wanting that are better, that are healthier, that are more kusala, more skillful than other ways of wanting. And does the set of texts referred to as Pali Canon get into that? And it actually really rather seems to. It seems to, sometimes it's rather hidden, sometimes it needs a bit of digging about, sometimes less so. But it seems to really kind of offer quite a sophisticated typology of desire that leads to or points to a refining of desire. So it's not so much we get rid of all our desires, but refine the way in which we experience desire. And it moves from something we might call desire in English towards things like aspiration, something more subtle and less about me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing about that as well. So folks who are listening to this episode, I'll be linking to Dave's site, www.dispirited.org, dispirited.org. And our guest today has been David Webster. Dave, thanks for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.